Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm excited to introduce Robert Anthony Siegel, who will be discussing his second novel, All Will Be Revealed. It's a tricky one. Mr. Siegel teaches creative writing at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and he has written the critically acclaimed novel, All the Money in the World. After the talk, there'll be time for questions. You can line up at that microphone over there. And after that, Mr. Siegel will sign books over at that table. And also, quick warning, there is some mild nudity in some of the slides, so just so you know. All right, please help me welcome Mr. Siegel.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here, where all the answers are. Can you hear me okay? I'm here with my wife, who read just earlier at noon, Karen Bender, and my two kids, Jonah and Meyer, who are downstairs Googling right now. And they were just so excited. They thought, that, I don't know, we sort of expected a bell to ring and then somebody would pull open a drawer and get an answer out, and that's how you got the stuff you see in the search window. But I'm going to read from All Will Be Revealed. The year is 1896. It follows the fate of three different characters. Incidentally, that's the cover of the hardcover. It's now in paperback. Three characters. One is named Augustus Auerbach, and he's made a fortune selling pornography through the mail, which was a huge business at the time. Some of you may have heard of Anthony Comstock, the Comstock Act, which made it illegal to do that. And of course, that was a reaction to the fact that so much was being done. The second character is a woman by the name of Verena Swan. She is a spirit medium, and you probably know that spiritualism, the idea that something essential about us survives death and continues on, was a huge religious movement in the second half of the 19th century, particularly after the Civil War, when so many people were mourning their dead. And mediumship was popular, widespread, and also a very big business. The third is named Theodore Swan. That is Verena's husband. He's actually dead. He's deceased. He died on an expedition to the North Pole. And of course, this is the era of polar exploration. Nobody actually reached, Peary reached that later early in the 20th century. And the South Pole was 1911, Roald Amundsen. So these three characters intertwine through the course of the book. Let me start at the very beginning. And then, I'm going to show some slides from the period to give you a sense of what their world was like. Verena Swan sat beside her brother-in-law, Leopold Swan, writing with a pencil in a large leather notebook. Head to one side, eyes half closed, she watched her hand move across the page, leaving behind line after line of small, jagged letters, the nearly illegible scrawl of her late husband, Captain Theodore Swan. She had no idea what it said. The deciphering was for later, after the rush of words. All she could think of right now was the pressure on the back of her neck, the tingling in her arm, the motion of her hand. All that mattered was the indescribable feeling of being borrowed, a sensation as strange as her first intimate kiss. At that very moment, Augustus Auerbach guided his wheelchair into the photographic studio behind his Fifth Avenue mansion. As big as a warehouse and built entirely of glass, the studio felt less like a building than a porthole for viewing the sky. Auerbach glanced up at the clouds, then wheeled himself across the floor to the bed at the center. As he did so, his two photographic models removed their dressing gowns and stretched themselves naked on the sheets. His assistant took up position behind the camera. "Let us begin with a kiss," said Auerbach, and watched as the models fit themselves together like the two halves of a broken cup. None of them could know that a dozen photographs later, despite careful precautions, an accident would occur. A child would be conceived. Auerbach put his hand to his chin and said, "A little more passion, please." Thousands of miles away, a group of men on dog sleds stopped before a canvas tent, half buried in snow. For weeks they had traveled the vast ice plain in search of that tent, till the size of the land and its utter emptiness shrank them to nothing. They had become like ants crawling over the surface of a mirror. Now the sky seemed made of ice, the ice around them made of sky. The sun burned beneath their feet. One of them dismounted and walked over to the tent, then parted the flaps and crawled inside. After removing his glacier glasses, he could make out a footlocker, a backpack, a pair of boots set in a corner, and a snowsuit laid out as if to dry. Eventually, he forced himself to look at the corpse lying on top of the sleeping bag, naked. The earthly remains of Captain Theodore Swan, missing 3 years and presumed lost. At the table in her parlor, Mrs. Swan watched her hand move across the page. "You see, my dear, there is nothing other than this turning, round and round again. Everything is connected to everything else. Everything moves in a great wheel, and the emptiness at the center is God." And that is the beginning. Let me show a little bit of, here's the mild nudity. This is how Augustus Auerbach got rich. And what you see here is a stereographic card. And the stereoscope, you may be familiar with it. The last incarnation of the stereoscope was the GAF viewfinder that I had as a kid. And essentially, it's a magnifying glass. These two images stare into the scope. The two images become one. And of course, this doesn't have the three-dimensionality, but it had this deep sense of space that seems very artificial to us now, but at the time was considered utterly lifelike. And actually, interestingly, the stereoscope predates the photograph. And it became a very popular medium for pornography. Originally, it started out with sort of views of the Grand Canyon, Paris, that sort of thing. And people got bored with that. And, but they had their stereoscope. It cost, about $1 or so. And so some clever guy somewhere started selling pornography. And this is about the sort of thing that Auerbach was creating. And here, again, is another. And this is the image that you would see in the stereoscope. And here, this is a lovely, I think it's lovely for the faces. I really, how could you say, it draws them back to personhood. Now, let me read a little bit about Verena, the spirit medium. Oh, no, wait. Before I get to her, let me read a little more with Augustus Auerbach. This is 9 months after the prologue. His photographic model, Jane LaRue is her name, is heavily pregnant now. Augustus Auerbach wheeled himself out of the office and down the long terrazzo corridor, past the hanging tapestries and suits of armor, the rows of Greek and Roman busts perched on marble pediments. The domestic staff was out in force for the morning cleaning, a swarm of little maids no older than 12 or 13, in black dresses and white aprons, armed with carpet beaters, feather dusters, brushes, buckets, and rags. They subsisted at the edge of his consciousness, pale, pinched faces beneath white-lace caps, turning to curtsy as he wheeled past, like heliotropes following the sun. He liked the sight of them, just as he liked the sight of the things they polished and buffed with their rags. The carved and gilt furniture he was too busy to use, had never used. They were the signs of his election. He turned a corner and drew to a stop before the large double doors leading to his studio, then managed a little awkwardly to let himself inside. His eyes were flooded with new morning light. Auerbach's studio was a former winter garden attached to the main body of the mansion, an elongated dome built of iron ribs and glass. He liked to think of it as a kind of mill or factory in which the power of light was harnessed to create photographs, just as the wind is used to turn a windmill or the water to drive a water wheel. But this strictly functional description did not capture the feel of it. The sky was everywhere, like the ocean surrounding a ship, and to glance upward was to risk a strange kind of vertigo, the feeling of falling in. A sudden fall in the light made one want to weep for no apparent reason. Many of the models did weep, but then they were in a particularly vulnerable state. Auerbach stopped to look around, thinking about apertures and lenses. He was used to living with this sort of complexity above his head. He managed by ignoring it. The only thing that concerned him was the light, which on this particular day was perfect for photography. Clear, clean, white, brilliant, but without the cruelty of summer. Good, he said, as if praising a subordinate. Excellent. Then continued on toward the stage set. His assistant, Elijah Grapes, sat to one side with the two models, Henry Twersky and Jane LaRue. They looked very small as he wheeled toward them, but then people always did in the studio beneath the ocean of sky. It was only later, in the photographs, naked and an inch tall, that they took on real size. The three rose like schoolchildren to greet him. Grapes doffed his bowler, Twersky removed his top hat, and Jane did a slight curtsy. "Good morning, Mr. A." Their voices sounded childlike in the vast space beneath the dome. "Good morning to you all," said Auerbach, coming to a stop. "I hope I find you well." He tucked his dressing gown and straightened the lap rug over his legs. "The light is splendid, isn't it? Are we ready to begin, Mr. Twersky?" Henry Twersky looked like a circus lion that had seen better days. He had a large, pale country face framed by wiry blonde mutton chops, his mane. His walnut-sized wrist bones peeked out of the cuffs of his frock coat, which pinched at the shoulders so he could barely lift his arms. "I just want to get out of these clothes, Mr. A." "You'll have your chance soon enough," said Auerbach, and then turned to Jane LaRue. "Are you ready, Miss LaRue?" Jane LaRue's girlish face had grown round and fleshy in the 6 months of her absence. She hid the rest of herself beneath an old army greatcoat, which she kept wrapped about like a cloak. "I'm ready, Mr. A." "Very well, then. Maybe we should take a look." This was the moment he had been wondering about. He watched her unwrap the greatcoat and let it fall. The pink nightgown took a little longer, as she had trouble working it over her head, but then it too was at her feet. And then there was a general hush as the three men contemplated the naked figure before them. All right. I just think back. I wrote much of this book while we were pregnant with our first child, and I think back about the shock of the pregnancy, the total transformation. And Augustus has never seen a pregnant woman. Now we're going to move to Verena Swan, the spirit medium. And I have here a few photographs of spiritualist stuff. From the beginning, photography was very important to spiritualism. First and foremost is a way of documenting what happened in a seance. And this is an actual seance. The woman at the center was a very famous medium at the time, Eusapia Palladino. You can see that they're around a table, and just as in the cliched expectation, they're holding hands. There was some sense that it had something to do, they used an electrical model. Of course, electricity was coming into vogue. Some of these photos are actually taken with electric lights. And so there's some sense that they're creating a circuit and their energy is moving through the room. Right. Very, very dramatic. This is different. This is a photograph of an actual spirit phenomenon. What was called a materialization, where the spirit actually took sort of physical form and was present in the room. The medium making it all happen is supposedly behind that curtain. But you can the photographer never published this in his lifetime because of the strong resemblance between the medium and the spirit in the photograph. And you can see that she just has some robes thrown over some other clothing that she's wearing. And we'll see her again. She was very famous at the time. Her name was Florence Cook. The spirit was also a household name. Her name was Katie King, and she would make pronouncements about just about everything, world history, and anything you could name, famous dead people. She was in contact with everybody. And the man to the left is the physicist William Crookes. William Crookes. We will see Florence Cook again. This is different yet again. This is what was called a spirit photograph, in which the photographer himself acts as a kind of medium. You would take a photograph of a person, and then some sort of dearly departed spirit would appear in the background. Very, very popular in its day. This was by a man named William Mumler, who operated in Boston, was eventually arrested for fraud connected to the photography and was acquitted by a jury. The woman in the upper left hand is Mary Todd Lincoln, much older, of course, and that is Abraham Lincoln behind her. And you can see it's a very crude likeness. She was a devoted spiritualist. As part of the reason why she ended up spent years in an insane asylum after his death. Often, spiritualism was a spiritualist practitioner in the family was an embarrassment to other family members. And these are by a Frenchman named Bouguet, who was also arrested for fraud, but convicted and spent a year in prison. On the stand, he made a full confession. He admitted that they were all fake, that the double exposures. Spiritualists refused to believe him. So invested in anyway, that woman is the famous, in the middle image, that is Florence Cook. And you can see, take a good look at her face, and you can see, I'll get you back to Katie King, the spirit. There, you can see, it's clearly the same person. Okay. So a complicated world to which photography was essential. Let me read you a little bit about Verena. Verena Swan, whose spirit medium is her dead husband, the polar explorer Theodore, but is having something of a crisis of faith. You know, it was a very exhausting, emotionally exhausting way to live, and mediums often did not last very long. Verena Swan took her bath and dressed in the clothes Leopold had laid out for her on her bed, a white velvet gown and red silk shawl, pearls, gloves, and tiara. She was ready on time, a very rare occurrence, but 10:15 found her hiding in the kitchen, pouring sherry into a water glass. Leopold came and took her by the arm. "I can't go in there," she said, glancing in the direction of the front parlor, where the weepers were milling. Weepers, their private word for the clients. "Of course you can," said Leopold. He was in a cutaway, his hair brushed back with pomade. "I can't and I won't," she said, and then gulped from the glass till he pulled it away, both of them careful not to spill on her dress. "These people are depending on you, Verena." "For what?" she gasped. The sherry was heavy and sweet in her mouth, sharp at the base of her throat. She felt dizzy and panicked, as if the ground were slipping from under her feet. "For whatever it is they get from you," he said. He put an arm around her shoulder and led her out of the kitchen and through the hallway. The noise filtered in from the room beyond, making her shiver. The hungry murmur of voices, the impatient clinking of teacups and saucers, the muffled pawing of shoes on the carpet. "I can't," she whispered, "please." They were standing at the double doors that led into the parlor. "Breathe," said Leopold, breathing in deeply himself. From the diaphragm, in, out, in. And then, before she could say anything else, he pulled open the doors. She stood for a single beat, blinking at the light from the electric chandelier. The room was full of people, holding teacups and butter cookies in postures of exaggerated civility, like children playing at a tea party. They looked toward her now, their faces forgotten, in expressions of such desperate need that they would not normally have worn them even when alone. Silence fell over the room. Leopold took her arm, and together they started forward, practiced as actors. She kept his slow, stately pace, careful to stand straight, to nod and smile, to breathe from the diaphragm. The strange, inexplicable thing was that she was good at this game, this play acting. The weepers turned to watch her as she moved, human sunflowers following the sun, eager to be noticed, to be singled out for a greeting, to be given a chance to speak and unburden. "Time to mingle," whispered Leopold. They split with practiced ease, Leopold moving off to the left, shaking hands, bowing, making his way toward the photographic equipment set up in the corner. While she mixed with the weepers, soaking up their sadness and confusion, he would take their portraits. So her brother-in-law, Leopold Swan, Theodore's brother, is a spirit photographer. And he and Verena work together. Well, the third leg of the triangle is polar exploration, also closely connected to photography and spiritualism. And that was the joy of writing the novel, to see how things were interwoven in surprising ways. This is Sir John Franklin, British, went out in search of the Northwest Passage, was never seen again. And the mystery of what happened, there's a great novel lurking in the story of Franklin. The mystery of what happened exactly lasted into the 1980s. And the thought is now that not only did they get lost and trapped in the ice, but they were poisoned by their own food supply. They had brought along canned tins, preserved meats that were sealed with lead and improperly sealed so that the lead leached into the meat. And that would explain a series of very, very bad decisions. It was clear, what probably happened is that the crew slowly went insane with lead poisoning. They found skeletons inland, dragging a boat that was full of fine china and silverware. Not thinking well at all. But I include Franklin because he basically shaped the trajectory of polar exploration for the next, 40 years. Anybody who wanted to raise money for a polar exploration had to go in search of Franklin. And part of this is because of his wife, Lady Jane Franklin, was an enormously forceful person who was adept at sort of publicizing, keeping them in the newspapers, and raising money for expeditions. And she became a committed spiritualist and was in touch with his spirit, who would give directions as to where to look for this ship or that ship. He'd traveled with two ships, and these directions were somehow never correct. Now, this is Elisha Kent Kane. He was sort of the Brad Pitt of his day. And it's amazing. Nobody's ever heard of him. I know this looks like an engraving. It's actually a daguerreotype, which means a photo of who he was. He was enormously handsome, very dashing. He lowered himself into a volcano in the Philippines. And he went looking for Franklin like everybody else, was marooned on the ice, had to travel 800 miles overland, wrote a book that was a bestseller. It was when he died in Cuba, it took 4 days for the train to make it back to Philadelphia, his hometown, because people were flocking. They wanted to see the train go by. They were covering the tracks. The train couldn't move. Not seen again till Abraham Lincoln died. Well, he also had a spiritualist connection. He had a secret romance with Maggie Fox, who's one of the Fox sisters, who were really founders of the movement. And she published a volume of their love letters after he died. She also claimed that they were secretly married, which his family did not like at all. This is just the frontispiece of a memoir one of his crew members published about the second Grinnell expedition. There was enormous public interest in polar exploration, sort of like the moon missions of the 60s. This, again, a photographic souvenir of the officers of the Jeannette, another ship that went out in search of the North Pole by a different route, also ended in disaster and congressional hearings. Large part of the crew died. Most polar explorations ended very poorly, but you see how photography was essential for documenting the experience. And in spite of all the sort of the bad endings and the ugly congressional hearings, the image of the polar explorer remained noble. This is Roald Amundsen, the greatest figure of, in the history of polar exploration. The year is 1899. And, you know, bearskin suit. How do you resist this? Snowshoes. He eventually found the Northwest Passage. I think that was 1905. All of his great feats were actually in the early 20th century. He beat Scott to the South Pole in 1911. But what I love about this shot, which is sort of early in his career, is that it's a total fabrication. It was done in a photographic studio in Christina, modern-day Oslo, Norway, right? So he's just standing with a backdrop of sort of clouds and snow. Incidentally, when he finally went out in search of the pole, he traveled with a photographer, as did Scott, too. They became, explorers became really adept at creating their own photographic publicity. Let me read a little bit. This is the last portion I'll read. From the voice of Theodore. Theodore has worked closely with Verena ever since his death. He believes himself to be alive and real, perhaps more real than she is. And that way, I guess it's a typical marriage. But he's never been willing to tell her what happened at the very end. So I'm going to read that bit about the very end. Let me find where to start. Okay. We threw away the geologic specimens, said Theodore, the scientific instruments, the charts and logs, all that made it a real expedition and not just a boy's adventure. And I emptied my mind, too, of everything extraneous to the job of walking. It was so interesting, Verena, to see what's left when you only keep what you need. The thoughts dwindled down to a handful, incredibly precious. That perfume you wore, you remember which? Lilac, said Verena. Yes, a clean, powdery smell, said Theodore. The house we were renting on 18th Street. You remember the brass knocker on the door, the curious? Yes, shaped like a clamshell, said Verena. That's right, said Theodore, with the green residue of polish caught in the ridges. I clung to these things, little bits of the past hidden away in my memory. They told me who I was. And then 300 miles more, and I threw those away, too. Threw them to the wind, and they were gone. I didn't need them after all. I knew who I was. You were my husband, she said. I will tell you what I was, he answered. I was everything that was not the whiteness. I was my opposition, my resistance. The snow looked wonderfully inviting, Verena. Just one more step, I would tell myself. Then you can lie down and rest. It doesn't matter if you never get up again. That one step will count. The act of walking seemed strangely complicated. The snow was up to our knees. It stretched ahead as far as I could see, a pristine white surface carved by the wind. Loose powder rose like smoke. To take that one step, I would have to extricate my foot from the snow, push it forward, and then plunge it back down. To lie down seemed so wonderfully simple, and the implications no longer so terribly ominous. But if I did lie down, I did not want a big fuss, to be lectured, to be laid on top of the sleigh, a useless gesture, and one we could no longer afford. No, I imagined them removing my harness. I imagined watching the sleigh move on without me, imagined it disappearing into the whirling snow. I imagined the snow covering me over, slowly at first, then more quickly, gaining speed till I was white, white, white. You remember that first day we met? I should have mentioned earlier, Verena and Theodore originally met by accident in a amusement arcade on Broadway, Lower Broadway, where they put their, it was a common sort of dating game. They had a man there with a little hand crank generator, and you could put your finger in, and the current would hold your finger there, and you couldn't pull it out. And they both did that, and their fingers were stuck. They were stuck together. You remember that first day we met? Asked Theodore. At the arcade, said Verena. And the funny little electromagnetic contraption? For a penny. We both put a finger in and couldn't pull apart, no matter how hard we tried. I didn't want to, said Verena. And Theodore answered, that's how it felt to die. Thank you. Finished. Thank you so much for listening. I am happy to take any sort of question, whether that's about polar exploration or Victorian pornography or novel writing, anything at all. My favorite cafeteria, I've been working my way through all of them, all morning. You can step up or...
I was wondering about your process for researching and then transforming that into the writing experience for you.
That's a great question. For anyone who didn't hear it, what was the interaction between the research and the writing? And I had no experience doing research before this book and didn't really understand that it would be research intensive when I started. And then research became sort of this wonderful obsession, and it definitely shaped my understanding of the characters and the course of the story. I would plunge in and then sort of pull out and do some writing, and it was a great way of avoiding writing, which anybody who has to write knows that the best thing about writing is avoiding it, because it's so painful. But because I didn't really come from a scholarly background, and I had never researched anything before, it was a total hodgepodge. I was teaching at NYU at the time. They had the wonderful library, and I would just sort of pull things off the shelf and start reading, and they would lead me to other things. But one of the best things I found were the diaries of Robert Falcon Scott, who's the man Amundsen beat by about a month to the South Pole. And, you know, he was, by current accounts, a terrible explorer. But he was a great writer. And the two things probably, you know, one had something to do with the other. He was a wonderful writer. He wrote up to the very minute that he died. He was caught in a tent, the last one alive, and took off his snowsuit and just wrote, in order to die quicker, and just wrote to the end. And the last line is wonderful. It's something like, I have so much more to say. Tis a pity. I have so much more to say, but my hand is frozen. And I just thought, you know, isn't that life itself? We always have more to say. oh, don't cut me off, but then the end comes. And the legend of Scott is just so rich and vibrant, and he helped create it through his diaries, even though the expedition itself was riddled with mistakes, mistakes that seemed to come directly from his personality. So I used a lot of what I learned from Scott for Theodore, a man who was perhaps not a great explorer, but a great self-dramatizer. At the same time, I didn't want to be ruled. The facts have to serve the story. The story can't serve the research. There's a temptation once you've researched something to put everything in. And I just had to pull out, pull out, pull out. It's mostly keeping it out. And what I did is I took copious notes on everything and then never looked at them again. And if they stayed in my mind and they connected to the story I was imagining in my head, I knew that they fit. But if I had gone checking my notes, I think I would have gotten lots of extraneous material in there. So it's really sort of trust the internal process going on inside your head. Everything in writing is like that. Anything else?
How do you go about creating characters in a novel? Do you start with all the characters in your mind, or do you build them as you go? Oh, this character can add to this, or...
Another great question. How do you get characters? And it's they're lurking in there somewhere, and they have something to do with people that you know, and yet they're not directly the people that you know. Augustus Auerbach is in a wheelchair, and my first child, my son Jonah, wasn't walking yet, but he was crawling, and I could see his desire to move, and how frustrating it was that he couldn't get up and walk. And so that's how Auerbach ended up in a wheelchair, because he's been removed from life in all sorts of different ways. His one connection, he feels most alive when he's taking photographs of other people, because he's so intensely isolated. And the wheelchair is only a small part of that. I mean, the two are not necessarily the same. So in part it was a reaction to my baby. And all the characters came in that sort of way. They're little bits and pieces of the writer as he argues out sort of the dialectic of his own experience in his mind. I think Verena Swan as a medium is the one who's closest to actually being a writer, because she sort of absorbs the grief in the room and gives it back as story. She basically imitates voices. And I don't know if anybody's ever been to a party where they had a magician performing, and sometimes what they do is a mind-reading act, and they're just wonderful at sussing out information and from you without you quite understanding that you're giving it, and then feeding it back to you. She's very much the same, just an extremely sensitive, intuitive person, a kind of lightning rod. And often writers function that way too, or hope to. So novels are built up, I think, very much sort of a kind of patterning of contrast. One character contrasts the other, sort of in this black and white, back and forth, one and zero kind of way. I hope that helps.
A few weeks ago, we had another author here who said it was very easy to explain why he wrote his first book, but having gone through that ordeal, he was at a loss to explain why he wrote a second one. Do you have anything to say on that?
It's just like children. I have two children. And it's like, after having one child, who would have another? But there's some kind of amnesia, and it must be chemical. And then going through it the second time with my daughter, who's 5, my oldest is 9, I would remember the horror of, changing the 5th diaper that morning, or, eating sand on the beach, or running out into traffic. And I was like, how could I have done this again? But you do it again. and hopefully with a little less anxiety. I notice my wife and I are both much more relaxed this second time around, and everybody benefits from that relaxation. That said, I'm working on a third, and it's very, very hard. But it's hard in a good way. All of you guys must recognize this from the work that you do. There's something that pulls you in because it's hard in a good way. And if you don't get that sort of hardness in your day, then you don't feel right. Some sort of, that desire to see pattern, I think, is a big part of it, and to feel the connectedness of experience. That's why in this one, All Will Be Revealed, I particularly wanted to try to connect things that seemed initially unconnected. I was very, very affected. I saw this Errol Morris documentary. You're probably all familiar with him. Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control. Just did a wonderful job of connecting these totally disparate things and showing the likeness and the complementarity, if that's a word. He had an expert in the naked mole rat. He had somebody in robotics. He had somebody who did topiary art. And they all worked together beautifully. So I wanted that. Anything else?
One more question. I've read some novels, I haven't read too many, but where historical incidents are the basis of the novel. Towards the end of the novel, the author always makes sure that current facts don't become falsified. Like, for example, if they build on some incident, they somehow bring the ending in such a way that today also it might be true, that it has not changed the fact. So why is it is it typical of all novelists?
Let me see if I'm misunderstanding you. Mm-hmm. So this is also a research question, right? How do you keep to the facts while telling what is by definition a false story?
Yes.
How does fiction remain factually true? For example, this is loaded with facts. That is also a great question, and one that I've struggled with, and it's in the news now. So the James Fry incident, there are any number of these, mostly they're books billing themselves as factual that turn out to have more fiction in them than initially advertised. And I don't have a great answer, but I can tell you what I decided to do. I fell in love with the research and finding out the factuality behind the fiction. But I was afraid that it would take over. So what I did is I just gave myself permission to distort in any way I chose. Shakespeare did it. What did Shakespeare know about any of the things? He'd never been to the continent, but everything is set in Italy, right? I just wanted to give myself the same freedom as Shakespeare. That said, I don't think there are any major gaffes in terms of facts. Though I wouldn't be surprised if somebody found one. For myself, I felt it had to be emotionally true, and it had to work imaginatively, and the facts were there to support the imaginative work, and I wasn't promising anyone complete factual accuracy. At the same time, because there are no actual historical figures in the book, I had wide latitude. And yet, as far as I know, everything is in fact accurate. So I guess I had it both ways. Does that answer your question? Did I get it right? It's also a little hard, for some reason that microphone's a little hard for me to hear.
Oh, okay, the question, you almost answered it, but
yeah.
The thing is, I see that most of the novelists just make sure that it always ends so that it doesn't distort the facts that were already, like the historical facts. Is it because that people will find it easy to accept the novel, or is it a style of writing that you always make sure that history is not distorted, even though you play with it in the middle?
I see what you're saying. Okay, even among fiction writers, there is a strong impulse to be factually accurate when dealing with history. Okay, that is certainly true. And I think it's because fiction writers are nevertheless writing about the real world. And there's some sense, if you didn't honor the factuality of the world, it would be like playing tennis without a net. You know, there wouldn't be any traction or any friction to play the game. There has to be some sense of engaging with the world as it actually exists and real life as we actually live it. And I think for that reason, fiction writers are often very careful about fact. And an excellent example is a wonderful British novelist by the name of Pat Barker, actually female, who has this trilogy about the First World War called it's usually called the Regeneration Trilogy. Regeneration is the first novel in the series. I recommend this so strongly. It is just so wonderful. But actual historical figures appear in the course of the novels. So she's meticulous about fact, biographical fact. It's set during World War I. In part, one book deals particularly with working class pacifists who were treated brutally in Britain, were jailed. That one's called The Eye in the Door, just wonderful. She deals with all sorts of characters on the margin of British society at the time. But it's the factuality that gives us a sense of a layered, complex, gritty world. I think so. You really see it working there. I would recommend that one as a way to see fact working for fiction. Thank you so much, and wonderful questions. I truly appreciate it. Pleasure being here.